Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
And good morning. This is Greg Hutchins.
Hey, Greg. Hey, you sent me an article the other day. And of course, then it's like you buy a red car. Now you see red cars everywhere. I saw like 3 articles and I sent you one of them. And it's all about supply chain stuff and people, companies all over the U.S. And it's been going on for a couple of years now, but people bringing parts of their supply chain or all of their supply chain back to the U.S. And it's all kinds of stuff in there to talk about. But one of the articles caught my attention was we don't know how to make some of this stuff anymore. And we don't have the skilled labor force that's ready to jump into all this new production. And I was like, that's, to me, that is a big, huge hurdle to overcome to actually get consistent, good components that don't cause problems down the road.
Boy, so where do we want to start with it? There's obviously we want to reshore from China, which is basically one risk. So, if you're basically making products or designing products, even worse in China, and you want to reshore, bring the manufacturing design back to the U.S., that's one risk component. But you brought up the other component, which is really interesting. We don't have the folks anymore with that detailed knowledge as to make the machines, as to design the products, and that takes generations.
Well, there's parts of that, but I think I've been in factories in China, and especially for consumer products where you're changing the model every couple of months, they don't automate a lot of it. And some companies do more automation than others because of their volumes. It makes sense to do that. But I've been on floors where it's shoulder to shoulder people doing each individual step. And attention to detail matters, and they have the right assistants and gauges and microscopes and everything, and lenses, everything they need to do that particular step well. And it's amazing. It's so flexible. If something changes, a component changes, you don't have to redesign your factory to take care of it. You just say, hey, do it this way now. No, okay. And it's part of the process. The issue I run into is that there was a report, a couple of weeks ago from I'm forgetting the organization, but it's an organization that represents manufacturers, U.S. manufacturing companies. And they're saying that in the last year, I've hired something like 30,000 people into factory positions. People that are making stuff, driving the forklifts and turning on extruders and managing equipment and stuff like that, as opposed to only 15,000 that got hired the year before. And they were touting that as a big gain. And I'm thinking, 30,000 people, that's not a lot. And it's been in the news of the last 2 years as people just can't find people at any level. The local barista, is a hot commodity. They can get a pay raise going across the street, so they leave. And then that person that running that coffee shop can't hire somebody. It's got to, is now stuck with shorthanded. But the story I'm hearing is that a good amount of the manufacturers existing in the country are having trouble finding labor, having trouble finding people that can drive a forklift, for example. And I'm using that as a rough analogy of somebody that has some skills at some level. But even worse, if you need a really craft quality type welder, for example, or you need somebody that really can manage the assembly of a complex piece of equipment and handle it. There's just a labor shortage in general, but in manufacturing, it's just twice as, and then we run into it over the years is in maintenance factories is that they just can't find people that want to get into the trades and do the plumbing and welding and mechanical work to keep equipment running. There's just not a stream of people going into those crafts. To me, the big risk of onshoring is a response to the lockdowns in China, shutting down factories, the transport issues, all of the disruptions that we've gotten over the years. But it's also, I mean, there's geopolitical, there's all kinds of stuff that goes into it. But I think you mentioned it when we were just chatting before we started. It's a trade-off. What are we, we're running away from one problem, but are we really thinking through the new problem? Because if I have to train a whole workforce or I have an insufficient workforce and I still have production demands and want to get products out the door, I worry about it from a reliability point of view is, well, what quality am I going to have? Because for the example I use is somebody's looking at a circuit board, right? Mm-hmm. If they're not familiar with how soldering processes work, how it should look and should not look, how, even knowing what to look for, you look at a circuit board and it's like, fine. You don't know what it looks like when it's not right. You don't even know what to look for. And I've run into so many people like that. And to me, and I've had lots of training and lots of experience looking at circuit boards, and I could look at one and go, that's an issue. We got to fix that. And they're looking at me like, how do you know that? And it's just, here's the evidence. Let's get on a good microscope and let's cross section it, and I can show you the details of why that's an issue. And they're like, oh, how'd you know that? Well, I've been looking at these things for decades, kind of thing. That, I think, is the heart of the issue, is that as we bring up more onshore production for facilities that are doing manufacturing jobs, is it takes time for the folks actually on the line to have the experience and skill set to determine what looks right and what doesn't look right. And the end result in my forecast is that we get a higher proportion of products that are just not good and won't last for the customers.
Well, I'll give you a couple stories, Fred. My daughter, you've met Margot, mm-hmm. was a mechanical engineering student at Oregon State. And since day one, I should say, day one, probably when she was 12, I would force her to do mechanical stuff. Mm-hmm. Refund a wrench, change a tire, simple stuff.
Yeah.
And I was amazed when she started telling me how I'm trying to search for the right word, because I want to be gentle about this. These are mechanical engineering students at a really well-known school, Oregon State, who have school smarts, but don't have mechanical smarts as to, what do you do with a wrench? Mm-hmm. What do you do with...
but you've seen products where a mechanical engineer on their CAD machine designs this beautiful piece of equipment, but in order to assemble it, you need clearance for that wrench to have enough lever on it so you can actually turn the bolt or tighten the nut and get the right torque on it. And if that's not included, and if you've never built stuff by hand, you wouldn't know that. It's, I'm just here's the piece of equipment, and it's on the CAD machine. It doesn't show the encasement or where it's located in the vehicle or, anything else. And so Margot has the advantage of having that intuition, or experience is probably the right word, to say, oh, well, these are things I need to include in this, because if I have to change this pump out, I need access. So the bolts need to be placed in a drawer. And I ran into a product where their highest failure rate was due to this connector falling off in the transport. Mm-hmm. So it'd be dead on arrival, right? And I said, why is that? You guys know it's a problem. Why can't you fix this? And he says, come here, watch how we have to build this thing. And they use one of these long telescoping rods with a mirror on the end of it. and some extra lights. And they would only like 2 people in the factory had small enough hands that they could get it down to the bottom of the equipment where this cable came through the case. And then they would use like 2 fingers and try to maneuver it into the right place. And the design of the connector had no feedback mechanism or locking mechanisms. So they kind of had to nearly blind kind of guess whether it was seated correctly or not. And if it was off by like 1 or 2 millimeters, it would vibrate right out. And I was like, who in the world designed this? Let's go talk to this idiot.
Well, it reminds me of some of my design failures. So what do we do? Going back to this thing, if we're going to reshore, how do we train an entire generation on simple manufacturing? How do we retain them? How do we attract them? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a big question beyond my part. From my point of view, it's like you need to be very careful with the design so that it goes back to remember way back when it was, there's a big push for design for manufacturing and get rid of screws and top-down construction and, you know, all these things. You make it so that you could only assemble it one way. I remember one professor, I took a class on this, and he was like, the ideal is that if you take all the components for your smartphone and put it in a bag and shake it up, it would self-assemble, you know, and just work. That would be ideal. And I'm like, well, I don't think that's how it works, but he got the point across. And he showed the example of a electric drill. He found an electric drill, like a late 50s, early 60s vintage, and took it apart and counted all the parts. There was like 17 different screws and 16 different types of screws of those 17. And they had like 6 different ways to make electrical connections, and it had hundreds of parts. And then he took apart a Black & Decker that was a modern one. And this, when I took the course, was years ago, and it's probably gotten even better. It had 7 parts. It had 1 screw.
Snap on. Yep.
Yeah. You know, you lay the bottom case down, you drop all the parts in, they intermesh and just work just perfect. And it was a snapped in electrical connection, one piece. And the screw is required because you needed a tool to access that type of powered equipment. That was the only reason they had a screw in it, because it was required. And it took seconds to build it, to assemble it. But you had the transmission or the motor and the gearbox and stuff in the chuck were all, those were 3 main parts and 2 cases and a screw and a wire coming into it. And that was about it. But it was designed such that those parts were built other places or assembled and by teams other places. But the final assembly was just amazingly simple. And a lot of our parts and products are that way. Cell phone is not a good example of that, or a car. So onshoring products like that, I don't think will be very hard. I think your point of retention and finding people that want to put this stuff together all day long, that would be the challenge. But hey, Amazon has been hiring hundreds of thousands of people to fill boxes and put tape on it. So there's a market. There is a skill set there for doing rote work and, with small variation type stuff, and they can get it done. But it's the folks checking the solder, for example, that takes some skill. Looking at welds and doing the welding and making sure the automated machine is actually welding correctly, for example. There are plenty of positions that do need the experience and training. And how to do that? We don't have the infrastructure for it. We don't have the trades in our community colleges like we should. We don't have apprenticeship programs that bring people up with these experiences and stuff. We haven't had really any manufacturing except for some prototype shops here and there that we don't have the workforce to scale up to do that. And that's, to me, presents the risk of we're just going to, unless the teams really pay attention to their processes and how things get assembled. And it's not as simple as saying, all right, well, we'll take pictures of the factory over in Thailand and then we'll recreate it here. I don't even when a factory moves from China to Vietnam, there's problems. I've never run into a move of a production line without issues. But bringing it here when you have the lack of depth of experience, I think that presents a whole new problem. And being very cognizant of that phenomena of needing to pay attention to, this is a whole new set of risks.
Interesting how you bring it back to risk. Yeah, it's this whole onshoring craze, if we can use that word, is, I think, going to accelerate because we don't have the opportunity anymore to move factories from China over to Vietnam or let's take Taiwan. I don't know what the current term it would be, but yeah, it's going to be a big challenge, and we need to basically at least have 10 years to be able to do that. And again, it's going to be a risk issue. We're trading one type of risk, meaning offshoring, to another type of risk, which is bringing the factory into a greenfield.
Yeah, well, it's just throughput and quality. It takes trained people and trained eyes to assemble vast majority of the products that we have. And there are exceptions that are just simple. But even then, if you don't, and you've run into it where a part of the process is it's all ready to go and you pick it up and an experienced person would say, this is light. Maybe there's a part missing or it rattles a little bit. And you go, I don't think there's supposed to be anything loose. But if you don't have even basic experience to say, to recognize those clues as a problem, you put it in a box and ship it. That's the part that worries me. And it's the processes and techniques and assembly, culture is not trivial. And I run into execs that say, oh, we'll just bring the factory back here and we'll put a shed out back and we'll build everything in there. And I'm like, okay, good luck.
Yeah, right. Lots of luck. Well, I'll just sort of bring up another story. I'm driving down the road and I'm amazed at somebody's got a flat tire and a guy is outside on a cell phone calling in a tow truck. And then I ask Margot, well, what's going on here? And she looks at me like I'm the village idiot and says, well, the guy doesn't know how to change a tire. Maybe it was one of those double duh moments, but I thought that most guys, all guys, were trained from day one on how to change a tire. But no, they reach for the phone and they get AAA.
Well, yeah. Well, when I first started driving back in the dark ages, it was tires went flat pretty often. And we lived in the country. So one of the chores once I got my driver's license was to run our garbage over to the county dump. And like twice a month, I get a flat tire there. And so it was just we didn't have cell phones. You couldn't call AAA from the dump kind of thing. Or on the road between, and the chance that somebody else would be driving by, with the tire, with the equipment you needed to do it. And so I had jumper cables in my car. I mean, I didn't have a modern car and steel belted tires and all that stuff. So you had to know how to do this stuff. Right. And it was just required. But my kids have, driven for years and they've never experienced the flat tire. They've had dead batteries because they leave the door open or something like that. But even that is way reduced because there's circuitry in some of the cars that say, hey, we're going to turn this off now because your battery's getting low. We won't be able to restart if you leave this going. So our systems have gotten so much better. Our tires have gotten so much better. Hell, some people I've run into don't even know they had a spare tire in their car.
Yeah, and that'll be our next podcast. So just give you a couple of rates. I went to a auto place and I asked them, okay, I need to have this done. The book says it'll take 4 hours to do this mechanical work on the car. What's your shop rate? The guy looked at me and said 135 an hour. I said, okay. And by the way, this is not a dealership.
Mm-hmm.
This was a just on the corner guy.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was talking to another person, again, coming up the trades. And I said, oh, you're a welder? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what type of welding? And mentioned TIG, MIG, stick, all the usual forms. And I said, oh, great. Well, I know a little stick and blah, blah, blah. So we were swapping stories, swapping lies. And I said, what's the day rate for you guys? He said, 2,000 a day. And I said, interesting, 250 an hour for a welder. He says, yeah. Yeah, and we're in huge demand. And I said, good for you. So the issue is getting people into the trades because trades are paying very, very well these days, very well. And the problem is a lot of kids, a lot of people don't want to get their hands roughed up.
Yeah. And what you also see is people don't want to, work in a coffee shop doing the cleaning or work here, there, or other places that they want to be the next entrepreneur, next software guru, or what it's behind a desk. And it's just day after day that I'm hearing stories of folks just having trouble finding just basic, people to fill positions so they can get the coffee served, for example. Part of the overall issue is that we've made, this is speaking just from my experience in the U.S., is that it's like in high school, it's almost always a college track or you're not. There's not another option for you, basically. Right. And going to college is seen as the thing to do. But I've run into people that they've gone to college, they get a degree, or a good number don't finish and get a degree. And but they get a degree in something that they can't find a position for. We don't need that many history majors. There are really brilliant people in the field of history that do a great job in the academic world or in the publishing world or in the museums and places like that. It is a great job. But there's only 6 of those.
You're going to get thousands of people with an art history degree who are going to be flaming you online.
Well, I know. Well, that'd be nice. We know somebody that's listening. But you get my point. If you go to school and you take underwater basket weaving, it just doesn't work that way. But there's a lot of, I remember taking physics in college, and it was a very small department. Very few people actually went into it. And I was asking my advisor once, why are there so few people taking physics or chemistry or the hard sciences type stuff? And he goes, well, you just said it. It's hard. There's a whole bunch of my classmates that their whole strategy was to take the easiest classes they could possibly do so they still graduated. And so, well, are you going to learn anything that way? And I'm like, no. So it's like, okay, whatever.
So when you use words like path of least resistance, that's really a risk decision based on their risk appetite. Think about that.
Oh, it is. It very much is. And it set of priorities and what they wanted to do and not do, and it's about whatever. But anyway, I think over the next couple of months or a year or couple of years, as this onshoring process continues to pan out, we'll see. I'll be happy to be pleasantly surprised that the U.S. manufacturing can find the talent they need and bring it up to speed and not be an issue. Yet pretty much at my point of view right now is that we've got a lot of work to do to mitigate. Here's another one of my risk terms here. The challenges of bringing up on new factories and new production facilities. I don't think it cannot be underestimated, and that unfortunately I've seen it underestimated way too many times.
I agree. I've had to evaluate some firms in China and Japan basically first-tier suppliers that the prime U.S. company OEM wanted to bring back.
Mm-hmm.
And the bottom line is they kept the places, in both cases, they kept the factory in China and in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because they couldn't get the people in the U.S. to make the products to the requirements, again, think quality, right?
Yeah.
That the company had.
Yeah. No, it's and there's all kinds of issues that's involved in that. But anyway, it'd be interesting to see how this all pans out. And if you're listening to this and made it through our rambling here for so far, and if you got an insight in this, if you're working to bring something back on shore and into the U.S. and what are the challenges you're actually facing? And I'm hearing stuff through the news and a handful of colleagues, but what's your experience? We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions or thoughts or areas you'd like us to discuss, let us know. Head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR. And Greg and I and the other hosts of the show are available through LinkedIn and our about pages on the site. So we'd love to hear from you and what your experience is. So with that, Greg, I think we'll wrap this one up and I don't know. They don't put markers on it. I mean, they say made in the USA. I'll have to keep track of ones that don't have that now and which ones change. Maybe we could do a little measurement system there.
We can talk about that some other time. Big issue, made in the USA or made in India and made in China. Anyway, Fred, great discussion. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Greg. We'll talk to you soon.
You bet. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.